Welcome to I Hate James Dobson, the official religious trauma podcast of the hashtag resistance. Welcome to I Hate James Dobson. My name is Jake. I'm a former evangelical turned queer sex therapist. Brooke is out this week. She's okay. We send our love to her. You don't come from a broken home. But I'm thrilled and titillated to announce our guest this week is my tremendous, thoughtful, and tenacious teammate, Kat. Hi, Kat.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you here. You are one of my coworkers and just an all-around rad person. Tell the readers a little bit about who you are. We'll start with therapy. What kind of therapy do you do?
I would say first and foremost, a relational therapist, meaning that the relationship is what matters the most to me. Not to be confused with providing relationship therapy, which I do not do. I only see individuals.
Uh-huh.
And then I guess in terms of modalities, I do a lot of DBT. I'm more trained in DBT than anything else, dialectical behavioral therapy. I'm a Marshall Linehan fangirl, for those who
Mm,
know. But I also have been learning more and more about somatic stuff, internal family systems. And so I've been incorporating those more and more as I've been learning.
I love that. I am also a Marsha fan. Sometimes when I find something, I'm like, that feels weird. I'm like, oh, Marsha.
Yeah. Have you read her memoir, autobiography? I don't know what
I
we
have not
call it.
read it in whole. I've seen selections of it, specifically doing DBT trainings, but she seems like a wild person.
She is. But honestly, I feel like that's why I got drawn to DBT in the beginning, is because her whole shtick is like, I created the therapy that I needed that didn't exist. And I think that's very badass.
I think that's awesome. Yeah. Kat, you have some experience in the world of evangelicals and ex-evangelicals. Why do you hate James Dobson?
Man, so many reasons.
Let me count the ways.
I would say truly, yes. I would say first and foremost because I have been personally victimized by his rhetoric as a fellow ex-evangelical. I feel like even though I didn't grow up in evangelicalism. I opted into it, which was a interesting choice that I made at the ripe young age of 17.
Mm,
So I didn't grow up like reading James Dobson books or whatever, but his ideas are so prolific that like you can't get away from them if you're in that world. And
yeah.
so it's funny because when I've listened to earlier episodes of this podcast, I have not read a single book, with the exception of I Kissed Dating Goodbye. But I have not read a single book that y'all talk about, but all of the ideas are so familiar already, just from like being in that culture and world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the joys of doing this with Brooke. Brooke has never once interacted with the evangelical world, and so much of this, she's like, oh yeah, I've heard that. I know that. That was taught to me. They are so
Right.
prolific.
Yeah.
What at 17, what drew you to? What was it like a peer thing? Was it like a spiritual journey that you were on?
I my lore, this is my testimony. I
Triggered.
I know. I'm trying to figure out how to like shorten this as much as possible. Basically, I was a diehard Girl Scout, which
Mm,
is in hindsight like maybe a flag that I was queer, but you know, whatever. I was very invested in Girl Scout and Girl Scout summer camp. I wanted to get a job as a Girl Scout camp counselor. I needed leadership experience. And
mm,
so the church that my mom had started attending, because she kind of started going when I was old enough to not go. I was like a teenager already, but they needed someone to go on their little middle school mission trip situation to help lead Bible study. And I was like, I can read, I could do that. So I
mm.
did. And then there was an altar call, and the rest was history. I got. But then I got really like sucked in because in college, I found what I will still say was like a pretty cool community through a campus
Mm,
ministry that I was a part of. And
mm.
so everybody was very like hip and trendy and aesthetic and artistic, and they had good music. And yeah, so that was part of what like really kept me invested, was friends, basically. Friends
Yeah,
and like the vibe, the aesthetic.
absolutely. And this has been kind of like a subtle theme throughout the show, but that it's not all bad. Like there are reasons that people are drawn in and stay, and it's not all just because people are horrible and evil or just strict, right? Like that's a part of it for some people, but also like you do meet cool people. It is a way to get community, and people have this spiritual drive in us, and it's a way to try to get that need met. So yeah,
Yeah, totally.
I think we're gonna cut this, but like my deconstruction journey a lot has been like, oh yeah, I hate that, or no, I still like that. I still like that person. Okay, I can't just throw that away.
Yes. One time someone referred to that process as not throwing out the baby Jesus with the bathwater.
That's brilliant.
Yes, I can't take credit. Honestly, so as a therapist that also does a lot of religious trauma work, a metaphor that I use a lot that's really lost on a lot of people who grew up in the city is I compare it to a roadside gym mining situation. Do you know what I'm talking about when
Oh,
I say
oh
that?
yeah.
Okay, yes, thank you. Immediately I lose so many people with that alone. But um where you get like a big pile of muck basically of like mud and rocks and like all kinds of stuff and you're tasked with sifting through it and figuring out what's worth keeping. Like I
Mhm.
feel like that is how deconstruction has felt to me largely is like letting go of a lot of shit, but like still finding like a couple actual gems in there if you're lucky, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good metaphor for it. And sometimes those gems aren't the cultural bit. Sometimes it's like, oh, so I wanted to be a pastor and I was going to go to school to be a pastor, and now I'm a queer sex therapist. But the
Mhm.
values that drove me to want to be a pastor are very similar to the ones that I hold now doing this job. And it's some of that like refinement process was like, oh yeah, this piece of me gets to stay the same and still gets to be valuable and worthwhile. You are our
Yeah.
first guest on the podcast who has any personal experience in this world.
Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah, it is going to be interesting not having to like explain us much.
Not having to give as much context. Although I don't know what I don't know. You know what I mean? Like I
That's true.
definitely feel like I was like fully in the fold for some years. But I do also think that having not grown up in it, you know what I mean? I've like heard of things. Like I remember the episode where you were talking about your experiences in Awana. Like I've
Mm,
heard of Awana, but I've never participated in it. So I think I'm kind of this like funny middle zone of like, I'm definitely an ex-evangelical. I've like been through the things. I was in the trenches.
you have your merit
But
badge, yeah.
right, exactly. But I also, I don't know, parts of it I don't, I guess, share or whatever.
Yeah. It also is really interesting to me because you stepped into this world right as I was stepping out of it in our lives.
Hmm.
So I have all the like the childhood stuff and the Awanas and the like early childhood baptism. And you have a part of it that I don't have a ton of insight into, at least personally. And it's really interesting. I also don't do a lot of religious trauma work as a therapist. Like
Oh,
working with queer people, it's kind of inevitable, but it's not a focus of mine.
yeah. I guess that makes sense, but also isn't. I think that I sometimes can get caught in the assumption that, like, because I do think this is true. I think a lot of therapists work with populations where it's like a shared identity or something like that, which is honestly fully why I was drawn to religious trauma work. It's not actually how I
Yeah.
got involved in it, which is like its own funny story. Because I worked at a Jewish organization, and so I worked with a lot of Orthodox Jewish clients, and that
Mm.
was really my first step into religious trauma work, which I think was really good that I wasn't doing it with like ex-evangelicals from the jump. Like I was still kind of on my own deconstruction journey, and that would have been messy, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that's funny because I'm realizing that I don't know the most about your practice either.
So I am a marriage and family therapist, so I deal with a lot of relational systems, and couples therapy, family therapy tends to be a lot like shorter term, very like problem focused. Like we're here to talk about fixing our sex life. We're here to talk about do we get a divorce or not. And so doing the deeper work of religious trauma isn't always a big part of that. And then
That makes
individually,
sense.
I have a lot of like depressed gay men is a lot in my caseload right now. And again,
Yeah.
there's some religious trauma there, but typically by the time they've seeing me, they've done some of that deconstruction already.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have clients who come to me like specifically to do deconstruction work or reconstruction work, actually, also.
Yeah,
People who have like done the whole deconstruction thing and then they're like, wait, this is also dark and scary. What do I do from here?
yeah. We haven't gotten into my deconstruction story in this podcast, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point eventually, but an important part for me, if anything, is when we deconstruct whatever problematic shit we're dealing with, religious trauma or white supremacy or internalized heteronormativity or whatever, we then have to build something new, not to
Yeah.
replace it, but these things support us and support us in the world, even if they do a bad job of it. So we got to keep find something else to support us.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your earlier point about how it's not all bad, like that when you're deconstructing, there are still some things worth keeping or whatever. That also with the things that like we throw away, it was serving a purpose, it was filling a void, it was doing something for us probably. And so trying to figure out like what do we do? What do we do when that happens?
Absolutely. When I when I have someone coming in with like some problematic behavior, whether it be self-harm or depression, or like engaging in pseudo-religious practices that they don't believe in anymore. This was a thing that I used to do was like, why am I watching these sermons when I don't believe this? It's just making me angry. It's doing something. So a question I ask is
Mhm.
like, what is this doing for you? It doesn't have to do it well, but what is it doing for you? Because it speaks to some
Yeah.
need. Absolutely.
Well, and I feel like humans, as a general rule, don't do stuff for absolutely no reason, you know?
Yeah. There's always some kind of logic to it. Sometimes an
Totally.
emotional logic, which doesn't fit into like a cognitive logic, but some kind of
Right.
logic there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is our first episode since the 2024 election, and I know that I'm still in the process of reorienting to our new hellscape of reality. Some of the dust has settled, and we're getting a clearer picture of what horrors await us. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what happened, what we can do moving forward, and how James Dobson is responsible for all the bad things that we see. So yes, we're going to have to talk about the election again. I am very sorry. First and foremost, I guess, Kat, how are you doing? How are you feeling about the election and reorienting this new reality? I, for one, am exhausted. That's my main feeling. How are you?
That's so real. Yeah. I mean, I think exhausted is the best word, specifically for the experience of being a therapist who works
Ugh.
primarily with queer and trans people in the wake of the election. I had the busiest work weeks, like truly the most clients I've seen, or most like sessions, because I had people need to meet twice, one person needed to meet three times. I saw more clients each week in the 2 weeks following the election than I ever have in my career as a therapist.
Mm.
So that's a lot, but it just kind of speaks to like the need and how people are feeling. I think I've been moving through the stages of grief, right? Like I've been raging and also, you know, sad. And I guess we're working on acceptance.
hmm I have seen in myself and my clients denial show up, not as denial that the thing happened, but more denial of feelings. Like, I just can't deal with this right now.
Hmm.
I'm numb. I'm not going to look at the news. And that's fair. That's not a critique. But to me, that's how denial has shown up more so than like, this thing didn't happen. Or maybe Kamala Harris can still win a recount in Pennsylvania. I don't hear a ton of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've also noticed, so personally, having a lot of ties to the South and swing state culture, I'm going to be honest, I wasn't surprised that Trump won. I think that
Yeah.
I expected it. I was bracing myself for it. And something that I've noticed is it seems like that's really a protective factor. At least that's how I felt like for myself. But I've also heard this from a number of clients that it seems like the more folks were like, well, like this sucks, but like just America doing America things, I guess. This is on brand. Um, the less maybe shocking and appalling and uncomfortable, like still uncomfortable, but you know what I mean? I feel like I was a little bit insulated by expecting it somewhat.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a thing that I've noticed is in 2016, a lot of people just could not believe that this could happen. And then in addition to doing the grief work, they were also like, what? What happened? What does this mean?
Right.
And not having to do that first step, I think, makes the work, the grief work, more not efficient in like a speedy way, but like we get to the meat of it in a more interesting way. Not even in a therapeutic sense, just for me, I was a freshman in undergrad in 2016, and there was a lot of what does this mean for me as a person going through the world? And this is the world I thought I was going to go into. And this time it's like, yep, yeah, but what are we going to do about it now? That makes sense. I hate this. What's next?
Yeah, totally.
My next question is, how's it been doing therapy in the weeks afterwards? Therapy is such a weird job because we have to help people process something that we ourselves in the middle of processing. I find that actually to be really helpful for me to hear people's perspectives and opinions and know that I am not alone and everyone else is kind of reeling from this is helpful for me. But how is that for you?
I think literally as you were saying that, I think I realized that I agree. And I think what's helpful for me about it is that it forces me to not be avoidant. Like I can
Mm,
definitely be very avoidant when things are stressful. I just want to like not think about it. And I can't do that. And I don't think that I would be served by doing that because like it is what it is. You know what I mean? Like it's happening. And I think that avoidance sometimes gets in the way of like I don't know, everything from like resistance to planning to like checking in on your people, like really important stuff that are part of my values. But I know that if I'm going to be showing up for client after client after client, and this is going to come up in every single session, then like I need to chew on that. Like I need to do some work to
mm,
like metabolize it myself before I'm there.
absolutely. My personal first therapy session after the election was kind of this just like purging of toxic stuff that I hadn't been able to deal with. And
Yeah.
I felt miserable the hour afterwards. And the rest of the day I was like, oh, okay, wow, back to myself. Cool.
Yeah.
Check that box. Okay, so I want to ground this discussion in some facts. What do we know so far? We have a pretty good idea of the results of the election, but some of the more nitty-gritty details we don't have a ton of information about. So what we know, obviously, Trump and the Republican Party won and won a lot. Donald Trump received more votes than ever in this election. He received 312 electoral votes, winning every swing state and cutting his losses, losing by less in basically every state across the board. More than 13 million people voted for Trump in 2024 than did in 2016. And the Republicans won the House and the Senate, but they won by less than Trump. And in some cases, they even lost the races. So there was a Senate race in Arizona, and Ruben Gallego, the Democrat, beat Kerry Lake, the Republican, by a pretty wide margin. And that was the state that Donald Trump carried. So it's bleak and it's bad and it's hard, but it's more nuanced than just everything is bad, this country is horrible. And I think when we really get into more of the numbers, it's every election that I've been able to vote in is all just fluctuating between like 5 or 6 points, and that's it. Donald Trump won the popular vote, but currently he's winning the popular vote by like 2%. That is a super close race. It's not a great sign that he's winning the popular vote, granted, but that's not. Joe Biden won the popular vote last time by 4 points. People won it in our lifetimes by like 10 or more points. It's like 2% is so small.
I don't think I even realized that.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's so tight. And the map looks very red and the trends are important to talk about, but it's still like it does not change the fact that it's a pretty evenly divided country in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's kind of hopeful because I am aware that he won the popular vote this time and that like a lot of the facts that you shared I am familiar with. And I think that all of those are icky and gross and hard to sit with, especially
Mhm.
like when you think about like Project 2025 stuff and what all that means and how many people are like, we sign off on this. This is cool. We like this. But I think that's cool to realize that it still was actually a really close race.
Yeah. And the narratives are still complicated. Anyone who tells you it was all good or all bad or all any black and white thinking is never correct, which is itself
Mm-hmm.
a black and white thought, but whatever. In states where Donald Trump won, also abortion referendums won. They were able to enshrine abortion rights into their state constitutions in a number of places. Donald Trump won, and we elected our first transgender representative in Congress. Like it's these things are complicated and nuanced, and it's very messy. And so a big question is like, how did this happen? There is no one answer. And everyone is still trying to understand it. Anyone who says we lost because of this reason is wrong. That being said, we are going to talk about why we think Donald Trump won and why Democrats lost. So, Kat, why did Trump win? Explain it to us.
Honestly, I have been, and this is probably, like you just said, it's not just one thing. Maybe it's my religious trauma speaking, but I've been really pinning this one on white evangelicalism.
Mhm.
I think that in a way that is really hard for me to wrap my brain around because, like, having been a person who at one time had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, I don't really see a lot of that guy in Trump. I'm gonna be so
Hmm.
real. Like, I've literally seen my family members post things that very directly parallel Trump and Jesus, that are very much like he is just like Jesus. And I'm not seeing it, but I think that that rhetoric, also the huge number of white evangelicals who I think are single issue voters, and the single issue is abortion bans and like
Hmm.
the air quotes pro-life movement. Um, I think that was a big part of it. I'm sure that I'm missing a lot of stuff, but I've been blaming it on the church.
And they deserve a lot of that blame. I have a number here. According to exit polls, which are unreliable, but it's what we have right now, Donald Trump won approximately 81% of white evangelicals. And that number has been very consistent throughout his entire this version of his political career. He was tried to be a politician a number of times in the past, and that didn't work. But this iteration, the fascistic version of him, has been white evangelicals have been center to his base. There are other reasons that I think are important to talk about, but that is a core part of this. And you were correct. A lot of those people are motivated by the quote unquote pro-life movement or anti-LGBTQ movements or whatever it is. I believe this was an overwhelming rejection of the Democratic Party, especially as it exists under Joe Biden. I have this divided into three different parts: the economy, culture war, and lies. And we'll get into more of these a little bit later. But I think when we're looking at extremism, it's which this kind of counts as and also kind of doesn't. But when we're looking at extremism, we have to look at the three N's: the need, the narrative, and the network. What need are people getting fulfilled by this? What narrative says here's how you get this need fulfilled, and what network helps sustain that? And it's not exclusive to the evangelical church, but they provide all three of those and then some pretty well. And it just, he's able to just graft on his message and his image onto the church in a very effective and deeply upsetting way.
Yeah. Also, the Trump Bibles are a whole thing.
Oh
Like,
my
I feel like
God.
even just his marketing is like specifically targeting trying to align himself with evangelicalism.
Yes. Something that I don't think a lot of educated liberals, and I don't use that as a compliment, I use it as a very neutral descriptor, people with like college degrees, I don't think they understand how motivated white evangelicals are about Trump. I'll say it, my ex-boyfriend turned out to be a big Trump guy. And when I was like, hey, you are a big like atheist gay man, you are also siding with people who want you dead and don't want us to be able to marry. He's like, well, Donald Trump doesn't believe that.
I hear that so much from so many people. It seems like there's so many people that, like, I don't know, perhaps believe the parts of his rhetoric and his, I guess, what's the word? Like the rhetoric of the people he surrounds himself with, just so selectively, which also, not to keep rage against the church, but I feel like I was very explicitly taught that we do not cherry pick, right?
Yes, that's what I was told.
And it's very much giving cherry picking energy, that like people will just believe the parts of it that they want to be true and then hear other things and be like, well, there's no way he's actually going to do that.
Yeah, and I think Donald Trump specifically rides that line in a way that I intellectually understand, but my body can't quite fully grasp, which is that like because he's not an evangelical, he gets to have that like distance from like, no, I'm not a Mike Pence, I don't whatever. But also that is absolutely core to his base, and they view him as one of them. So
Mm-hmm.
this brings us to our main media point for today, and it is not a book, but when I think about why has the evangelical church been so captured by Donald Trump, it's a question that I've been pondering at this point my entire adult life. The media that I've connected to the most, that's explained it the best to me, is not Jesus and John Wayne, which is a really good book about the white evangelical church. Highly recommend it. That does a great job. But to me, the piece of media that has been the most effective in explaining it and showing it is the limited series on Netflix called Midnight Mass, produced by Mike Flanagan. Kat, are you familiar with Midnight Mass?
I think I've watched it. Is it like kind of spooky?
Yeah.
There's a church. It's like a maybe rural maybe island community
Yes.
where it's
Yeah,
cold. Okay, yes, I've seen it. I clearly don't remember a ton about the plot. I'm going to be honest.
that is okay. So, readers, spoilers for Midnight Mass, although I highly recommend that you watch it. This is a 7 episode miniseries by Mike Flanagan, who is one of the best horror creators of our time. He created The Haunting of Hill House, Haunting of Bly Manor, which are regarded as like modern horror classics. Midnight Mass is him grappling with religious trauma. He was born and raised Catholic, and so it takes place in a Catholic church, but I think a lot of the metaphors work really well for the white evangelical church. A quick rundown of the plot. Midnight Mass takes place on an island community in vaguely New England, northeastern America. It's not really specified. In my mind, it's Maine. I don't think it's ever said. And this community has been run down. It used to be a pretty thriving community. They relied a lot on fishing, but there's been oil spills and people have been out of work. And so it's a very small community left after the rundown of this. The pastor of the church, it's a priest, it's Catholics, I'm going to say pastor. The pastor of the church is gone, and a new person comes back and takes his place. And all of a sudden, as he starts preaching and he's very charismatic, miracles start happening. People who've been paralyzed start walking. People who needed glasses to see don't need those glasses anymore. People who are old and frail start reverse aging. And it's a miracle. It's miracles all over the place. But it's not actually of God. This word is never used, but it's a story about vampires. The the new priest is actually the old priest who had gone on a trip to Israel, got stuck in a cave with a vampire who gave him vampiric powers and essentially restored him to a younger version of himself. And now he's young, he's not old, he has his memory back. But this guy's a pastor and believes this is an angel of God. Literally, the word that's used, they don't use vampire, they call it an angel the entire time. And so he brings back this angel to the island and starts Catholics love transubstantiation. So you're eating the body and blood of Christ. They take this pretty literally. So the vampire literally pours his blood into the communion wine, and everyone who takes communion there starts becoming slowly a vampire, which is why they're being healed. In order to become a full vampire, though, you have to die. You have to let the vampire's blood completely take over yours. And so this entire show, all the first 5 episodes are leading up to this really dramatic night in the church on Easter, where the pastor reveals all of what's been going on and asks people in a very Jonestown-esque way to kill themselves, to drink rat poison and become born again in a pretty literal sense. And then the people, a lot of the believers, having seen all of these miracles, having seen the signs of God, this restoration, this revival, do. They kill themselves, they drink this poison, and they do indeed come back. But they come back as vampires. And then they start attacking their fellow townsmen because they are just insatiable. They need to have blood, they need to feast, they need to eat. And so there's this literally like 25-minute long scene in the second to last episode of just ravaging the church. And it's so difficult to watch. And it's one of the best pieces of media that I've ever seen. And then the last episode, the new vampires run out into the town and continue to attack people and eat people. But they're still people. Even while they're vampires, their humanity remains intact in a way. And so quickly, throughout the course of the last episode, they realize this is so fucked up. This is really bad. And through the work of some people who have been working to try to fight the pastor who had figured out the conspiracy before it got full blown, they burned down all the houses. They burned down every building there. Everyone binds together and decides just to wait for the sunrise. They realize that this cannot happen. This cannot continue. And the last shot is them singing a hymn until the sunrise and very quickly goes quiet. They're all gone.
Wow. Wild how little of that plot I retained having watched it.
It's such a good show. I highly recommend. If you haven't seen it, my summary does not do it justice. If you have seen it, it's worth a rewatch. It is very hard to watch at times, but it is so good. The reason, though, that I think that this is such a good analogy for the white evangelical church is I don't believe most people who voted for Trump are just straight up monsters. I don't think that they're just motivated by bigotry and hate. although that is a part of it, that's not their main motivation. I think a lot of them, a lot of white evangelicals believe that Trump will get them where they need to go, where they want to go. He'll bring back, like, this is a rundown town. These are people who are desperate, and this is a person who's promising revival, renewal. That's what Trump is doing. I think he's a fucking liar about it, to be clear. And it's not just economic anxiety, although I think that's a part of it, but like a really important skill for therapists to learn, and Kat, I know that you have this, is to listen to what people are feeling and not so much what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes what they're saying isn't actually the truth, or they're saying some dumb shit, but there's a real nugget of something true. And not only true to them, but true in a real sense underneath that. And so when you hear the racists say like white culture is being lost, or even like the trans stuff, like they're trying to like transition post modern neo-Marxism or whatever, the actual parts behind that are stupid and destructive and really bad. But there's something true underneath that. And to me, it's that we are kind of losing our culture. And not white culture, not even American culture, but like the fact that every town in America has a Walmart, a Panera Bread, and the CVS on every corner, but no independent restaurants. I think that is a real problem. The fact that there's no sidewalks or third spaces, places for people to just go, like a park. Churches are kind of the last vestiges of that, where you can just go and not spend money and just hang out with people. But even those are dying in a way that's, I don't mourn the loss of evangelical churches, but the loss of those spaces in spiritual centers is a tragedy. I think that's the truth under all the bullshit of what people are saying. And having someone to come along and say, yes, I'll fix that for you. Yes, here's the way forward. Here's a way that fits into your already established beliefs. Something else that Midnight Mass does very well is that they justify every step of the way. Why is it okay to eat people? Well, that's what Jesus did. You can't go outside in the daylight. Well, in the last days, God will pour out darkness upon the earth, and so you're well suited for that, right? Like they justified every step of the way using the Bible, and they end up hurting. They hurt the most vulnerable in their communities. The earliest people out are the town drunk. He's just straight up murdered. A person who was arrested for drunk driving and killing somebody is ostracized. There's a lesbian character who's not a part of the main group that gets ousted pretty hardly. Those are the people who are most hurt, but it also hurts those people. One of the main characters is a mom, and you follow her son. He's the one who got arrested for drunk driving. The mom is one of my favorite characters in the show. She has such a loving, open heart. She just wants the best for people. She wants the best for her family, for her son. And it's evident from the very first second she's on screen. But she becomes a true believer in this. It's not because she's an evil monster of a person. It's because she wants to believe this so badly. She wants to believe that her faith, she wants to believe revival, she wants to believe that things can and do get better. And so there's no other alternative. No one's offering any other way for things to get better. So she's swept along with it. And by that point, it's too late. It hurts other people, but also hurts themselves. She doesn't want to be a fucking vampire. There's a really beautiful scene where she tells off the like religious nut of the show, the one who's doing all like the true, there's not really a villain, but she's tells off essentially the villain of the show. And she ends by killing herself. She's a vampire, so she gets brought back. It's a little bit undercut, but she doesn't want that. She doesn't agree with any of this. But at that point, it's too late. And to me, that is how Trump's fascism functions in the evangelical church. That's also, I think, why the Democrats failed. They didn't offer any meaningful, real alternative to people's issues, right? Like Kamala Harris said, I'll give you a tax write-off for this, or I'll give you money for a house. And that's great. Economically, that would benefit me and a lot of people I know. That'd be important. But it doesn't get to the fundamental issues underneath.
Totally. I also feel like, I don't know, as you're saying all of that, I'm thinking about the thing you said about the truth beneath whatever people are saying
Yeah.
and the culture wars of it all. And I'm just thinking about how hungry people are for like hope right now, you
Yes.
know? And I think this is across the board. Like, I think this is perhaps one of the few things that like everybody in this country can agree with. But I think the disconnect is like where we expect that hope to come from. And I think that's
Mm,
something that Trump did really well, is just almost like saying, I see you, to the people
yes.
who feel so disenfranchised, but in a way where they don't feel like their disenfranchisement is given any like merit, basically. Like I'm thinking
Yeah.
specifically about like poor white folks, like low
Hmm.
income, white, cisgender, heterosexual men specifically. But like I think
Yeah.
poor white people in general.
Yes. There's a tendency that I have seen and that I've experienced myself among, again, not a compliment, educated white people to be like, well, actually, here's why what you're feeling is wrong.
Yes.
And maybe that's true, right? Like people are saying like the economy is bad. If you look technically at the markers of a good economy, our unemployment is low, inflation is low, GDP is good, whatever. That's not what people are talking about. Their pain is real, and just saying, well, technically your facts are incorrect, you're missing the point in a big way.
Well, and also maybe this is again a hot take coming from my personal religious trauma, but I think if I learned anything from being an evangelical Christian, it's that things feeling real matters a lot.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
more than facts to a lot of people, more than science, more than what is provable. That, like, I think if we have a real felt sense that something is true, we'll hold on to that longer than like anything anyone else throws at us.
Up until it doesn't fit their worldview, right? Because that's the same
Mm,
reason that I knew being gay wasn't a sin, because how can the love that I have for my partner is beautiful, it's productive, it makes me motivated, it makes me want to protect it, it feels pure in this way. It feels just like a heterosexual relationship in those ways, but that's bad. That's wrong. And you can't trust your feelings. We said in purity culture as well.
right, of course. But also, I would not to like double down on my thing, but like,
Go for it.
because I think I deconstructed for a similar reason. Like, I did conversion therapy stuff. I tried really hard to not be queer, and it didn't work, it turns out. And so I think that for me, how I would say that is like that felt sense actually was bigger and stronger and greater than the felt sense of like my beliefs at the time, you know?
Yes.
And I was told I can't reconcile them. So I went with the thing that felt impossible to let go of, basically.
Yes. Absolutely. I think yes, and I think my point was that like the evangelical church rests on people's feelings of it being true up until they don't
Mm-hmm.
agree with them. But individually, we go with what feels true. And I think that's a really important point in all of this.
Totally. And yeah, I guess that's perhaps why there's like kind of the mass exodus, like why there's fewer and fewer and fewer people. At least this is what I've heard from like evangelical sources. I don't actually know the numbers here, but I've
Mhm.
heard a lot of discourse around like the church just isn't thriving in the way it used to. So many people are rejecting these values. And I feel like that's probably why.
Yes. Yes. And that is factually true. The numbers of especially evangelical churches are declining. And I think you're right. People are saying this doesn't feel true. This doesn't feel real. How can you ask me to believe these things? How can you ask me to believe that gay people are inherently predators when my brother's gay and I love him and he's just a fucking guy, right? That felt sense is real. And so this, I think, gets me to the real question that I think is important to talk about, that I've heard a lot of people revamp, comes up a lot now that it's Thanksgiving, which is, do you cut people out of your life because of this or not?
That has been coming up so much in my client sessions.
What are you seeing? What are you feeling? How are you navigating those conversations as a therapist?
Very case by case, obviously.
It is nuance. It is relationship dependent. My general rule is what respects the relationship. The conversation around like, do we cut off family is one that a lot of queer people are really well versed in. And a lot of queer people have really complicated answers about that. And that's not a bad thing. I think it speaks to really conflicting needs and wants in relationships. So when I came out, my family of origin and I had a pretty tough go of things. And despite all of it, despite some really difficult times, we remained in relationship with each other. We remained talking and working on ourselves and working on our relationship. And now we're in a place where things are really good. They're better than I ever could have imagined them to be. I feel really supported by my family in a lot of really important ways. Conversely, my ex, after this election, I had to cut him off because I knew that if I was going to stay in a relationship with him, every time we spoke, I would just get angrier and angrier and pissed off. and blaming him for things that really weren't his fault. He lives in Maryland. Doesn't matter who he voted for. Maryland's a reliably blue state. Doesn't give a fuck. It's not his fault that Social Security is going to be cut or whatever. But I knew every time I saw him, that's what I'd want to talk about, and that's what I'd blame him for. And that's just not respecting that relationship. It's impossible to respect the relationship that we had. So I had to cut it off there. That's my general rule of like what respects the relationship. Because most of the time, it's really hard. Most of the time, it's really hard to navigate that. And what counts as respect, respecting me, respecting you, respecting the relationship is nuanced and complicated. And we have to figure out boundaries. But cutoffs are such a extreme, severe thing. It's kind of like the ultimate end of that spectrum. I cannot tell you, readers, to cut off a relationship or not. Sometimes you have to. My only word of advice is it's never fun. It's not a good time. In my experience, both personally and then doing therapy, people don't like feel great about cutting off a relationship afterwards, especially a familiar relationship.
And there's such a grief process there too. Like
Yeah.
it's having to go through grieving someone who's like still alive, which is, I don't want to say harder. I don't know. Grief is hard always, no matter what, but it sucks. I don't know, in a particular way where you see this person who you were once maybe close to just like going on with life
Hmm.
and you're not a part of it anymore. And sometimes that's necessary, right? Because sometimes being like them being a part of your life made your life a lot harder, you know? Like I think
Yeah.
especially if there's like abuse happening or like, any of those like very obvious, like it's more clear cut that there is something close to a right choice. But I think more often, and I think this is often really true when it's something that's like sort of politically or socially motivated, that sort of like you were saying earlier, like, I don't know, I don't really believe that most people are 100% good, 100% bad, right? That
Uh-huh.
like, even if you decide to cut someone off because parts of that relationship really sucked for you or really untenable, there were probably still some good things about that relationship, about that person, about what they
Yeah,
brought into your life. And so who's to say which is more painful, right? Like going on and tolerating those differences or having to grieve that loss.
absolutely. And it's in some cases an impossible decision. Sometimes you just have to go for it, whatever it is, and figure it out as you go along. My next note is echoing what you said. I fundamentally reject the narrative that people who voted for Trump do it because they're just bad people. And honestly, that's just evangelical morality with a different name.
Ooh, that's a good point.
Obviously, voting for Trump, I believe, is a bad thing. You're voting for massive deportations, harm for vulnerable people, trans stuff, just poor people, right? Like there's all that, sure. But most people weren't at the voting booth thinking about all the trans people they hate. They weren't muttering racist remarks about Kamala Harris while they pushed the button for Trump. That's not to excuse the bigotry and racism. And some people absolutely were. And that is a fact that we have to deal with. I think there's a tendency among like the liberal pundit class to be like, oh no, they're just poor white people. So no, some people are just straight up bigots. Some people have hate in their heart, and we have to deal with that too. But I don't think that's the majority of people. Implicit biases are just that, implicit. They work in vague and insidious ways, more so than just outright bigotry. But this often means that they also aren't the primary motivator. So I believe that Kamala Harris and the Democrats lost because they weren't and aren't honest. People are hurting. I started working as an adult in a serious, I have a 401k healthcare kind of way at the start of COVID. The idea of me being able to buy a house is ludicrous. I'm not going to be able to retire. Social Security is not going to exist for me. I'm going to be working up until the day I die, right? Like these are things that I just got into the adult world knowing about myself. And for all of the policies that Kamala Harris was going to implement, it wasn't going to fundamentally address those things. It might help, but it's not going to fix it. And this hurt is more than monetary. Again, it's hard to talk about this in a way that doesn't like appeal to neo-Nazis, but there's a culture part. We are losing our culture in some way, and that's a real thing. To be honest in this moment is to admit that the system is so incredibly rigged against average people. It's to acknowledge that our government is overrun by self-interested millionaires hoping to be billionaires. It's to tell people that we are still living in the COVID pandemic, and to take real steps to mitigate it, not least of which being providing free vaccines and tests. It's to tell people that this was the year we passed 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, and then to actually do something about it, not just talk about giving Elon Musk more tax credits for Tesla.
Literally.
Oh my God, right? To be honest in this moment is to say that it's capitalism that is killing us. It's the infinite pursuit of growth. The line must always go up, damn the consequences. And the Democratic Party, as it currently exists, will never do that. They are funded by massive corporations. They are inherently invested in maintaining this capitalistic cancer that's destroying the world. I have no interest in saving the Democratic Party. That is work for someone else. God bless you. But I'll say what I want to say, and I'm not going to try to couch it. Like saying capitalism has to go, that's not an electorally winning message. But
Totally.
but the feelings behind that, I think, are right. When you look at Bernie Sanders, is an incredibly popular politician because his policies address the fundamental failings of capitalism. Even if people don't like the idea of a socialist, right? The language doesn't matter, but the feelings are real, and the people resonate with those feelings.
It's interesting because I feel like, you're talking about American culture, like kind of disappearing. And I feel like capitalism is American culture in so many ways.
Ooh,
And I think
yeah.
that's part of why so many people are so married to it,
Hmm.
because people are just like, I agree with, socialist, communist, like any other sort of system that could be like kind of compared, contrasted. I think give Americans the willies because like we've fought against communism and like people are using
Hmm.
socialist as an insult. And I'm not saying we should be either of those things per se, but I do think that capitalism is so intertwined with American identity that I
Yes.
think even when it's super obviously not serving any of us, except for, the 1%, people get the ick at like the idea of it being challenged.
Yes. And this is not exclusive to just the church, but my hot take is that evangelicalism as it exists in America, it's worshiping capitalism. It puts Jesus on the
Mm-hmm.
front of it, but fundamentally the way that it functions and structures and things that it promotes are capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I believe most people aren't explicitly partisan. This idea of like Democrats versus Republicans, when you talk to individual people, that's not how most people think. That's not how most people go through the world. You can talk to people. You specifically, Kat, are very good at talking to people, but you, reader, can talk to people with whom you might disagree. You can talk to Republicans, and you will probably find out that you have a lot more in common than you think. And a lot of the same problems that you see in America are very likely the same, right? I hate RFK Jr. I think he's going to be horrible for our public health in ways that are going to be unfixable, essentially. But we do have poison in our food. That's a real concern, and that's a real concern that a lot of people have. He just provides them an answer that I think is fundamentally wrong. The economy is bad. I don't think massive tariffs and cutting unemployment is the way to fix it, but the economy is set up in a way that screws over the average people, right? Like when you're able to listen to what people are feeling, often you can resonate with that. It's not your job to fix or convince any given person, but we do need to talk with people. We do need to see beyond these differences that are kind of pushed on us if we have any hope of making anything different, coalition building. Also, I think importantly, most people hate partisan politics. I think the number one thing I've heard from everyone, therapy, family, friends, whatever, is that like I'm just so tired of all this bullshit.
Totally. Yes. And I also think that like probably on most sides, like I feel like I have, a lot of friends, clients, whoever who are like, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a leftist, or I'm this lean this way, or this or that. But I feel like the same thing is true with the Republican Party, right? Like
Hmm.
I think it's, I don't know, perhaps more nuanced and complex or something like that, because I think some people have really drank the Trump Kool-Aid. And since he's now the face of the Republican Party, there's more of an identification. But I also feel like so many people who are like libertarians or whatever voted for Trump. I also feel like there's a lot of people who, don't I feel like I've even heard this from people in the church, like people who are like, I'm a Christ follower, I'm not a Republican, that like,
Yes,
honestly, a claim could be made that like the whole partisan politics thing is giving false idols.
absolutely. Absolutely. I am as like anarchist leftist whatever label you want to put on it that I think is reasonable to believe. And I still voted for Kamala Harris. I'm still a registered Democrat for more so like logistical. I want to be able to vote in primary reasons than anything else. But when you go like just one step below the surface of a label, you get to a lot more of an interesting conversation. Bigotry is a big factor in this, though. That is important to talk about. The white evangelical church. I grew up Southern Baptist. That is a denomination of Christianity explicitly founded on the desire to bring slavery back. Like it is baked into some of that theology. But it's often now more implicit. And implicit biases, internalized bigotries aren't permanent conditions. So many people change their mind on gay rights once they actually know a gay person. A similar phenomenon is happening with trans people. Historically, it happened with interracial relationships and people of color, right? Like, I didn't want my daughter dating a black guy, then I met Ken. He's great. I love Ken. It's part of the family. And it's not always as like shift from one camp to the other. Often there's some like remaining bigotry that exists, but it becomes a lot harder to dehumanize a group of people when you put a human face to it.
100%.
You have to decide, reader, who, when, and how you want to engage in these conversations. But I do think it's important that we have them. Those in power seek to divide us, and we do indeed have some real divisions. But we need each other, and we need to work with people and be in a relationship with people with whom we disagree. And we can disagree without sacrificing our values. We can disagree without campaigning with Liz fucking Cheney, for instance.
Gosh, that's so real. Yeah. And I also think, to your point about the importance of having these conversations, first of all, I think social media has pushed us further away from that. Like,
Yes.
I think it's funny because like we're more connected than we've ever been. We know more about each other than we ever have. But I think engaging with folks online just gives everybody implicit permission to like be a little bit more of a dick. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
everybody's just like meaner when you don't have the co-regulation of your bodies in a room together, or when you're not looking at someone in the face and like making eye contact and like,
Yes.
you know, um, and I also think this is making me think about the whole conversation around like, do you cut people off because of this? And I
Hmm.
think something that I have been really intentional to not project onto my clients, but a value that I hold is that talking about politics and social issues, for me at least, is deeply uncomfortable. I hate it. I'm
Hmm.
going to be so real, not a fan. But I also think that people's minds are more changed in relationships than
Yes.
anything else. And maybe this is influenced by like me being a relational therapist, right? Like as a relational therapist, I believe that the main thing that can enact change in a person's life in the therapy process, it's not about what interventions am I using or what modalities of treatment. It's more
Hmm.
about creating that like trusting, supportive relationship. And I think that's where healing and change can happen. And I think in the same way, again, if someone's being abusive to you, or if someone, if you hold an identity that that person is wholeheartedly raging against, do what you got to do to take care of yourself. This is maybe not your battle to fight. I think that these conversations should be the work of allies. But I
Mm.
also think that as a person who is an ally to communities that I'm not a part of, aspirationally at least, that I need to tolerate the discomfort and like challenge people sometimes and like explain ways that I maybe felt similarly to them at a point in my past and what
Yeah.
my process of changing my mind looked like, or find ways that we can agree and empathize and then go from there about like, but here's how I see this part of things. I think that sometimes cutting people off, despite all the grief, like depending on how close you are to that person, I think sometimes that can be a bit of an easy way out. Certainly not trying to
Yeah.
imply it's easy, both and, right?
Yeah.
But I also think that sometimes, like, again, if they're not personally coming for you in a way that makes you unsafe, like I think about this as a white person, that like
Mm.
my, neighbors, relatives, etc., like when people say or do racist things around me, that's not jeopardizing my safety as a white person, but it's jeopardizing the safety of other people in my community. And something I could do in that moment is sort of like step in and call them on it, say something, try to, do what I can to disrupt the situation. And it's so much safer for me to do that than a person who's like personally victimized by that racism. And the same,
Yeah,
sub in trans identities, queer identities,
absolutely.
immigrant identities, right? Like there's, it's a generalizable concept.
Yes. And every person has a different window of tolerance for those things. Despite me not doing it, religious trauma in a therapeutic sense, I actually spend a lot of my time talking with evangelical pastors. My family is still involved in that world to a degree, and I have made a peace. I found my way to navigate that, and I'm still unapologetically myself. We can have those conversations without sacrificing our values. I've talked with a lot of pastors around like, hey, you have queer people in your congregation. You probably have trans kids in your congregation. What are you going to do about it? And how are you going to navigate that in a way that's not going to make them want to fucking kill themselves? I can do that. I've built up a tolerance for that. Some other people might not be able to, and that's okay, but we all have a role to play. We all are an ally for some marginalized community.
And as much as I want to, if this election has taught us anything, it's that we like need to be involved in our communities, I think.
Yes.
Like I just, especially in the days following it, wanted to dissociate into my phone and like not talk to anyone. And
Yeah,
I don't always want to be engaged in that way. But I also, one, have values that would support me doing that. And two, I want to live in a world that's better than the one we have right now, And I
yes,
don't think that us going further and further into our polarized corners is how we're going to get there.
absolutely. And I don't think this is just again, Democrat versus Republican thing. The like meme with a lot of truth is that there's no people who hate leftists more than other leftists online. Go out and be a part of those in-person conversations. Try to give people grace. Even if you're not interested in trying to convince people who voted for Trump, that's fine. Build and strengthen your community with people who largely already agree with you. Because there's going to be disagreements, and you have to learn how to navigate those too. I have this naive and unyielding belief that a better world is necessary and possible. And I named it as naive, and I'm fine with that. And I'm also not going to let that go. I think that is so motivating for me. This has been delightful, and also like we talked about feelings and empathy and gay shit like that. Let's just like, shit on James Dobson as we're coming to the end of this. One of the
Yay.
worst things about this is that the worst people are happy.
Ugh, I know.
Elon Musk and James Dobson are thrilled about this, and that drives me nuts. The James Dobson Family Institute, in just 2024 alone, posted 40 different times about the election, 40 different blog posts and entries about this
Wow.
election. They are very motivated. They are very excited. I said this in our little bonus episode, but the day after the election, when I was grieving and very hungover, I woke up, I looked at my phone, and one of the first things I saw was an email from the James Dobson Family Institute congratulating Donald Trump on his win, which was just
Oh
a
no.
horrible way to start that day. They've had at least three different posts since the election. I just want to read some highlights to you and we
Oh
can cry and
gosh.
scream together. Some parts of it. Quote, President-elect Trump reiterated last night that he believes God saved him from the assassin's bullet because he has something he wants Trump to do. The president-elect believes God wants him to unite the country, heal our divisions, and restore the American dream. To do that, Christians must continue to engage in culture in the public square.
Ew.
Gross. With all of our conversation around like empathy and building connections, it's also okay to just hate some people, right? Like, I'm never going to try to convince James Dobson. This whole podcast is I hate James Dobson. I'm not going to change that. No one could pay me any money in the world to change my feelings about that. That's fine. Fuck that.
It also is a little bit trolley problem coded in that I think if James Dobson didn't exist, then so many people would be better off. And also, probably some people would be alive who aren't?
That's so real. That is devastating and true. Yeah. Um, Another quote, the James Dobson Family Institute is pro-marriage between a man and a woman and pro-life. We reject the transgender ideology that has harmed so many vulnerable American children. The Trump team is already finding qualified men and women to fill what could be hundreds of judicial appointments in his second term. Those judges will help Trump defend the sanctity of life, religious liberty, and the freedom of religion.
I
Gross.
hate this so much. I also feel like trans people are just trying to exist. Like,
Right.
I think it's so crazy that that is such a part of the culture war because truly, like, people are just trying to live. Like, it's really not a whole agenda.
Yeah. The only trans agenda is that trans kids don't want to kill themselves. That's the
Right.
only thing I'm working towards
And I
politically.
love that agenda. I'm very here for that. I don't know if you were privy to this, but there were ads because I'm a person who has an antenna to get network TV, and because I live in a swing state, there were literal ads. Like a direct quote from a Trump campaign ad was, "Kamala Harris is for they, them. Donald Trump is for you."
Hmm.
It was a huge part for such a tiny proportion of the population. It was such a massive part of the campaign.
Yes. Yes, I am unfortunately very familiar with that rhetoric in that ad. I think it worked in part because it addressed people's underlying bigotry. And again, that is an important part, and we have to address it. And I take a lot of issue with people who say, like, oh, it's just this. It's just, no, it's bigotry. That's part of it. But it also is, again, going back to that Democrats aren't honest, right? They're trying to focus group all the things and try to like earn your votes by saying, like, you're a Latino, you care about the border. You're queer, you care about this. And it just reduces people down. And so Donald Trump is for you, the American. I think it's a
Hmm.
big appeal to it. It's gross and horrible, but yeah, I see why people gravitated toward it.
It really didn't land though, watching that ad with my partner who uses they, them pronouns because they're like, oh, for they, them. Wow, thanks.
Yeah, the last quote, and we'll spend some time on this quote. We like what we see so far. For example, Trump promised to restore the close alliance between the US and Israel, which frayed under the Biden-Harris administration. The president-elect and the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have already talked by phone 3 times about how to bring peace to the Middle East and safeguard Israel's security. That's standard rhetoric. This is the part that gets me. Our friend Mike Huckabee, former Arkansas governor, is the new U.S. ambassador to Israel. His pro-Israel record is second to none. Readers, for those of you at home, Kat, covered your face with your hands in shock.
I just haven't thought about Mike Huckabee in so long, and it's been
Mm,
great.
it's been wonderful, hasn't it?
Oh man.
Readers, put a pin in Mike Huckabee. Our next couple episodes, we're going to focus a lot on Mike Huckabee and his beliefs. But Kat, what do you know about Mike Huckabee?
Um, Mostly, I feel like in my brain, he is famous for his massive amounts of homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia, all of that stuff. I feel like he is a politician for whom that was the real like foundation of his campaign and work.
Hmm. Specifically, in this case, Mike Huckabee is a horrible choice for this because Mike Huckabee is a Christian Zionist, which is a specific brand of Zionism. We don't have to get into Zionism right now, but Christian Zionism is the most anti-Semitic belief I can imagine.
Okay, yes. Also, as a person who was raised Jewish and then converted to evangelical Christianity, I have some thoughts about this.
I'm
Um,
sure.
Including that I feel like it's like icky and weird. Honestly, so I felt like I was very pedestalized in my
Yeah.
evangelical communities for like having Jewish blood, which like first of all, you hate that language, but that's what they said.
Hmm.
Um, and it was very much the like Christians who would culturally appropriate Passover Seders and who
Yes.
the whole thing with Christian Zionism was built on the notion that once all of the Jews return to Israel, then Jesus will come back. And
Hmm.
so, how is any of this helpful for the Jewish people? I mean, it's not because that's not their concern because Jews are going to hell, so who cares? But
Yes.
but I feel like especially looking at like what's happening right now and so many Palestinians have been absolutely murdered and those who still have been surviving this whole time are literally starving to death and living in the worst conditions I could possibly imagine, that like maybe the thing we should center if we're following Jesus isn't like making him come back as soon as possible. Like maybe it's the like loving your neighbor of it all. Like what about that part? I don't know.
Yes. Cat. From your lips to God's ears. Yes. Part of the reason I wanted to touch on Mike Huckabee in this case is Mike Huckabee in the past has, I don't think he's explicitly said this, but he's gotten real close where he'll be like, I'm essentially a Jewish person, just a Messianic Jew, because I worship a Jew, Jesus, but it just obscures the fact that's they want Jesus to come back so that Jews are kicked out of Israel and all die in hell. That's so anti-Semitic.
Right.
There's no other word for that. You're meeting their immediate political concern, and that's what matters to a lot of these people. So they get to like, we're pro-Israel, and that's what matters. But
Yeah, it's
yeah,
also just like using a community that, like, let's be honest, doesn't have the best track record of having rights or whatever,
yes,
um, as pawns for like your own religious agenda, which is gross. We don't like it.
yeah. Instead of villainizing the Jewish people to be like, they're eating babies or whatever, they're like infantilizing them to be like, they're so close, but they just don't know the real truth. They're like these poor Jews, but they're still gonna die in hell. But like, oh, I feel bad for them. It's like that's still anti-Semitic. I don't know what else.
Yes.
Like, just because you're objectifying them in a different way doesn't mean that it's okay.
Right. Yes.
Kat, we're gonna pause around here. Thank you for being on this journey with me. I want to use some of this rage that we're still going off of to say, oh my God, I hate James Dobson.
I hate James Dobson. Ugh.
This has been an incredibly productive and insightful conversation, Kat. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Oh, also, important logistical note. We are on Blue Sky now. We are leaving Twitter because
Ooh.
I don't want to give Elon Musk any more money. So we are on Blue Sky at I Hate James Dobson. I don't know how Blue Sky works. Readers, thank you for joining us on this conversation. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new series that I think is going to be fun. We'll say fun. It'll be fun. It'll be fun to torture Brooke with at least, and we can take some solace in that. But until then, take care of yourselves. I Hate James Dobson is Labor of Love, written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Jake. I'm honored to be joined by my amazing co-host, Brooke. If you're enjoying the show, please consider rating and reviewing it, and if you want to connect with us more, you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, and YouTube at I Hate James Dobson, and on Twitter at I Hate JDobs. If you want to email us, you can do so at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com. Special thanks to Drew, Lindsay, DJ, and Jack. Our theme music is by Mood Maze, and the song is called Trendsetter. Thank you for enjoying our show.